freedom. But what kind of freedom are we really talking about? Today, freedom often means doing whatever you want, whenever you want, without consequence. But is that true freedom, or is it something far more dangerous? There's a kind of freedom that looks beautiful on the surface but rots the soul from within. The freedom to indulge every desire, to escape accountability, to reject all boundaries. This is what I call satanic freedom, liberty without limits. The Quran teaches that true freedom is found through submission to God. In Surah Al-Baqarah 2:256, it says, "There is no compulsion in religion. The right path has become clear from the wrong. We are not forced, but we are guided." God's guidance is the boundary that protects true liberty. Without boundaries, freedom becomes chaos. Think of a road with no traffic lights and no rules. The result isn't freedom, it's wreckage. The same is true in society. When people say, "Don't judge me, I can do whatever I want," what they often mean is, "I don't want consequences." But the world doesn't work that way. Every choice has a consequence. When we remove God from the equation, we remove moral limits. We begin to celebrate sin under the name of liberty. We glorify rebellion and mock righteousness. Look at modern entertainment, the music, the screens, the feeds. What's celebrated? Vanity, wealth, promiscuity, selfishness. We're taught to believe these things are empowering, but in reality, they leave people empty, disconnected, and lost. We think we're evolving when we abandon God's guidance, but in truth, we're devolving into moral chaos. Real freedom doesn't mean the absence of discipline. It means the presence of purpose. It means knowing what's right and choosing it, even when it's hard. Satanic freedom tells you to follow your desires above all else. It whispers that accountability is oppression, that morality is outdated. But that's a lie. Real freedom is the power to say no to temptation and yes to your higher self. Consider a drug addict. They're free to use, but are they really free or enslaved by their cravings? That's the illusion of satanic freedom. It feels like liberty, but it's actually bondage. God's laws aren't chains, they're keys. They unlock the best version of who we can be. When you live by divine principles, you find a deeper kind of freedom. Freedom from guilt, from addiction, from regret. In today's culture war, one side celebrates moral relativism, but believers must stand firm, not in hate, but in truth. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is say, "That's not right," not because you're better, but because you care. In Surah Al-Furqan 25:63, God praises the servants of the Most Merciful as those who walk humbly on the earth, and when the ignorant address them, they say, "Peace." Righteousness isn't arrogance, it's strength wrapped in humility. Freedom without truth is not freedom, it's deception. Satan's greatest trick was never violence, it was persuasion. Convincing people that wrong is right, that boundaries are burdens, and that judgment is evil. Real freedom lives within divine limits, not because God wants to control us, but because He wants to elevate us, to protect our dignity, to guide our hearts. So ask yourself, are you truly free or just unrestrained? The choice is ours. Will we chase the illusion of freedom or embrace the truth that sets us free? We broke the chains that bound our faith only to forge new ones around our hearts. When truth became uncomfortable, we called it judgment and replaced it with feeling. And so, the worship of God faded until all that remained was the worship of ourselves. Today we buy what we wear, what we eat, what we listen to, even what we believe. But can we buy culture? Look around, and you'll see that the only culture left in the world today is commercial culture. A culture built not on truth or virtue, but on the worship of popularity. Its temples are shopping malls and screens. Its priests are advertisers and influencers. And its gospel is simple: be happy doing everything shameful to God. This is the culture the world now calls freedom. But it is not freedom, it is control. It commands you what to desire, what to admire, what to fear, and what to forget. And it rewards obedience not with peace, but with pleasure. Advertising and entertainment have become the twin prophets of this false religion. Together they preach the message that feeling good is more important than being good. They tell us that sin can be made beautiful if you film it well, and that truth is only real if it trends. Culture, once born from faith, family, and meaning, has been sold to the marketplace. Every tradition is now a brand, every belief a product, every emotion a marketing strategy. We have traded moral depth for digital applause. We perform what was once sacred and call it content. We imitate identity and call it expression. We follow the crowd and call it freedom. But this is not culture, this is conditioning. A system that teaches the human family to celebrate what God condemns and to mock what God commands. It tells us that shame is outdated, that pride is power, and that righteousness is arrogance. And under its spell, entire nations now sing songs of rebellion, smiling all the way to their own destruction. Markets don't care about meaning, they care about sales. They promote what entertains, not what enlightens. They reward the bold, not the pure, and what cannot be sold is slowly erased. True culture cannot survive in a world that worships numbers. It requires conscience, not algorithms. It requires faith, not fame. But the world no longer believes in truth, only in visibility. What is popular becomes what is right, and what is right becomes what is ignored. The result is a society that has lost its soul, a civilization that knows how to build machines that think, but no longer knows how to think with conscience, a people who laugh at holiness and find joy in rebellion. So yes, culture has been bought, and those who bought it now control the hearts and minds of billions. But there is still hope, because true culture cannot be manufactured, it must be lived. It cannot be sold, it must be earned through humility, sacrifice, and faith. Real culture is not what we wear or post or sell. It is the moral compass by which a people walk. It is the memory of righteousness written into their daily lives. It is the courage to say no when the world demands your silence. The culture of God cannot be bought because it cannot be branded. It is not performed for applause. It is lived for truth. And those who still live by it, quietly, faithfully, are the last guardians of what it means to be human. So can culture be bought? Yes, the world has bought it. But the question now is, will you sell yours? Be not conformed to this commercial world. Walk with awareness, live with purpose, and protect what is sacred before everything pure becomes entertainment and everything shameful becomes normal. This is Beyond the Veil, from the Museum of Truth. We built altars to our own image and called it progress. We crowned desire as our new king and named its throne freedom. But every false god demands a price, and in serving them, we became slaves once more. History often remembers empires for what they conquered, not for what they corrected. And yet, one of the greatest moral turning points in human history came from a power that had once built its wealth upon human bondage. When the British Empire abolished the slave trade in 1807, it became the first great power in history to turn against the very system that had made it rich. At first, few believed it would last. The slave trade was deeply woven into the economies of Europe, the Americas, and Africa itself. But Britain did not simply stop within its borders. It sent its navy across the seas to stop everyone else. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron captured thousands of slave ships and freed over 150,000 captives. The British government pressed other empires, Spain, Portugal, and France, to end their own trade in human beings. It even challenged the Ottoman Empire in the African kingdoms that profited from selling their neighbors. For centuries, the internal African slave trade had supplied labor for local plantations and domestic servants. But by the mid-1800s, Britain's campaign against the trade stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. It was one of the first humanitarian military efforts in world history, an empire using its power not for conquest, but for conscience. And yet, the world did not welcome this awakening. Arab traders along the East African coast fought bitterly to preserve the traffic in human lives. African rulers who had long sold rival tribes to European merchants turned their armies against Britain's interference. Without relentless pressure, backed by naval force and global influence, slavery would have continued far into the modern age. But perhaps there was something more at work in this transformation, something beyond politics or economics, because no single nation, no local kingdom, and no tribe on earth had ever been able to end slavery. It was too vast, too ancient, too profitable. Perhaps it required a global power, one capable of reaching every shore to finally confront a global evil. And maybe, just maybe, Providence allowed such an empire to rise for that reason. Even the colonization of Africa, though born from greed and exploitation, carried a strange and unintended consequence. European powers took advantage of African nations, dividing lands and resources for their own gain. They destroyed traditional systems and imposed foreign rule. Yet in doing so, they also broke the economic networks that had sustained Africa's slave trade for centuries. By force, they ended what local kingdoms could not end themselves. Colonization brought oppression, but it also closed the last great markets of human bondage. Since Ethiopia was the only nation that wasn't colonized, its slavery didn't end until 1935, the same year Italy invaded it. And Mauritania became the last African nation to outlaw slavery in 1981. It is one of history's great paradoxes that something born of domination also became the tool that ended another older form of oppression. Maybe this too was no accident of history. Perhaps the Creator withheld the full light of the industrial age, the power to reshape nature itself, until humanity had first confronted the darkness within its own heart. How could mankind be trusted with the engines of progress if it had not yet learned the sanctity of human life? Perhaps it was only when the world finally rejected slavery that God permitted the next age of knowledge and invention to begin. Yet even moral awakening does not erase a guilty past. The wealth of the empire, its cities, its banks, its monuments, had been built on the backs of those it now sought to liberate. True repentance isn't measured by words or laws alone, but by acknowledgement and by justice that restores, not just reforms. Still, the British abolition stands as a profound contradiction in human history, that those who once chained others could, through struggle and awakening, become instruments in breaking those chains. It reminds us that nations, like people, are capable of both corruption and redemption, and that moral power begins not in perfection, but in the courage to change. Because even an empire can fall and still rise to fight for what is right. And perhaps that rise, in the end, was never just Britain's doing, but the quiet movement of a higher will guiding human history toward its next awakening. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Beyond the Veil. I hope it gave you something to think about, something that will bring you closer to the truth. Next week, we will continue exploring where faith, culture, and history meets reality. And I'd love for you to be a part of this journey. Make sure you subscribe, share this video with a friend, and leave a comment to let me know what stood out to you. Together, we can bring more light to the world. See you next time.